Dr. Christopher Essex is a professor of applied mathematics at the University of Western Ontario. He is a former director of its theoretical physics program and a former associate chair of applied mathematics. He made one of his first correct estimates of the entropy production rate of the Earth, and with Dr. G.C. Kennedy and Iris Berry, he computed the first correct peak temperature for laser radiation. His work was featured at the Joint European Thermodynamics Conference held in Germany. Professor Essex is co-discoverer with K.H. Hoffman of the entropy production paradox arising in the context of anonymous superdiffusion. Yes, I know. He has co-chaired sessions of the World Federation of Scientists, and he became chair of the WFS's Permanent Monitoring Panel for Climate in 2011. In 2012, as chair, he hosted Dr. Václav Klaus, president of the Czech Republic, as a guest of the panel meeting. In 2016, he became chairman of the Academic Advisory Council of the Global Warming Policy Foundation. Now, just to let you know, when I first got this bio, I thought, I've got to pare this down. But it's such good reading. It's an amazing CV. Professor Essex held an NSERC, or Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, postdoctoral fellowship at the Canadian Climate Centre to work on its GCM climate model. He built his first computer climate model in the 1970s. He held an Alexander von Humboldt Research Fellowship in Frankfurt, Germany. He was a sabbaticant at the Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen, Denmark, supported by a Danish National Bank Foreign Academics program. There he worked on the thermodynamics of the citric cycle in mitochondria and its connection to fuel cells. He is an award-winning teacher and a recipient with Ross McKitrick of the $10,000 Donner Prize in 2002 for the book Taken by Storm, The Troubled Science, Policy, and Politics of Global Warming, which had a second edition in 2007. That book was a finalist for the 2002 Canadian Science Writers' Book Award. He was first appointed by the Canadian Governor-General to the Governing Council of NSERC in 2006 and reappointed in 2009. NSERC is a billion-dollar government corporation that funds fundamental research in Canada. He became the first U.S. Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholar from a Canadian university in 2012. That's remarkable. Considering Phi Beta Kappa goes back to 1776, that's pretty good. Professor Essex has been mentioned by name on the floor of the Canadian Federal Parliament, but not necessarily in a good way. You didn't put that in here. He has a blessing from the Vatican. His work has been cited on the floor of the U.S. Senate, and he has lectured at the British House of Lords. Both Freeman Dyson and the late Leslie Woods personally advised him in the much misunderstood but crucial art of scientific heresy. Please welcome Professor Christopher Essex.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And I should say, while I do this high-tech approach to my lecture, which is to just take a moment. Okay, there we go. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me here. It was a great honor, especially an honor to speak on the subject in connection with the Freedom Party and clearly the launch of their political agenda on climate. Although I don't really intend to talk much about climate, I've spent a lot of my career talking about the fundamental science behind it, and it's a subject I've been involved with probably almost longer than anybody alive. I'm really quite tired of explaining to people scientific things because generally they're not interested, and that's of course the really frustrating thing of a scientific topic, that people are not interested in the science about. Now of course people here would probably be interested, but I think a lot of the opposition isn't. And they tend to focus on political ways of talking about science, and that's really what I want to talk about, is that aspect of it. I also want to say it's a pleasure to do this talk. It's not my normal kind of venue for speaking. And it's also because it's on the occasion of Halloween, so it's coming up, and so I would like to scare people a little bit. And of course I do that first of all by wearing a tie, which of course nobody in my profession does, and it's a very much a Halloween kind of thing for me. So scaring people, it can be done in one of two ways. I can show you in a horror movie, or I can scare you with the truth. And that's what I'm going to actually do. Is I'm going to, hopefully by the end of this you'll have a proper Halloween scare about the way the universe really is. So it's a perfect thing for Halloween. So one accumulates over life. I mean, I should know first of all, Halloween from a calendar point of view is a very specific kind of thing, and many people don't realize that between the autumnal equinox, which is in September, and the winter solstice, halfway in between, there's a point called the cross-quarter day, and that's Halloween. There's another cross-quarter day between winter and spring, which we celebrate with Groundhog Day, and that's one of the reasons where the 6 weeks comes from. It's a month and a half, right? I mean, it's 3 months for the whole season. So if you want to know what the sort of structural idea behind it is, there it is. But it also is a time when people feel that, or at least historically, superstitiously, and traditionally, people thought about the world as being close to the other world. Because it's this magical halfway point, and somehow the worlds are close together, and so one thinks about all of these scary things. And of course, I think about some of the scary things that I've been involved in my life. And as you get older, as many of you probably know, you have more and more near-death experiences to speak about. And if anyone survived them, are the ones who survive them are the ones who actually grow old. So the old people are where you have to look to find near-death experiences. So I've had a few of them, and I want to talk about one of them. Once I was on an emergency landing of an airliner, and it was a pretty terrifying experience in a lot of respects. My reaction to it was basically to sit very quietly, and somehow we ended up surviving. There was no way of knowing that we would. But you would be surprised. I mean, everything that happened on that plane was just straight out of a catastrophe movie on airplanes. I mean, people would, all the things that you would expect. Is there a doctor here? There's a pregnant lady. Does someone speak Spanish on the plane? And of course, inevitably, you have the guy who says, "We're all gonna die. We're all gonna die." And he was sitting right behind me. And not only that, but he was actually an aircraft designer. And he was saying to all of us, everyone who could hear, that these planes are old. They shouldn't have been flying. We're all gonna die. I didn't do what I was thinking of doing to him, but he definitely was one of those people who kind of needed, a smack, so that he would say, "Thanks, I needed that." I mean, that was, but that didn't happen. Well, what was going on was that we lost all hydraulics on the plane, so they couldn't lower the landing gear except manually. The brakes wouldn't work, and we all landed with our heads between our knees. And I would say, just for fun, and we didn't survive, but you wouldn't buy that, right? But the elephant in the room is there. And I just want to make this clear to everybody. I'm going to say, for Halloween's sake, the elephant in the room is, we are all going to die. I mean, this is not a big deal. This is, in fact, just part of the realities of life. You realize that when you have one of these experiences, that it's all going to happen to us. It's kind of like the little apocalypse. It's to kind of, get your feet wet and get into the apocalypse. It's thinking about dying. Maybe just you, not everybody. I mean, big apocalypses when everybody dies, but just you. And one of the things that might pass through your mind, and I don't exactly remember whether that passed through my mind on the plane, because I think I was so distracted by the guy saying we were going to die, was whether I deserve to die. Do I deserve to die? And that's another aspect of apocalypse. That's the idea of Judgment Day. The idea, in that case, would be a personal Judgment Day, but did I live a good life, and did I do good things, and can I escape that by being good? All these things. So you have two things going on. One is the physical crash prospect. You have the natural world aspect, the physics or the engineering issues that happen with the failure of the hydraulic system. And that's all about in the fact that we're going very fast and we're high, and that we may land in such a way that it's not conducive to survival, right? I mean, that's those are the physical aspects of it. And then you have the other side of it, which is the kind of morality, religious, political, humanities kind of thing, right? I'm a professor of the inhumanities, and these other people are the professors of humanities, and they think about things like morality. It's the inner human experience. And really what I want to get across is that you have two different modes of thought. Actually more than two, but it's practically, from the point of view of someone in the inhumanities, that it's really just two. There's actually communicating or interacting with the reality of the outer world outside of humans. And then there's the inner world about, which is just as important. I don't want to make it seem like it's not important, but the real issue is, in the end, what about how they cross and how they mix up? And one of the things I'm going to lay out in this talk is that only bad things happen when you let this inner world somehow define the interactions with the outer world. You let these inner issues become part of the scientific world. And that is one of the big problems we have today. And in fact, it's one of the big problems we've always had. And I'm going to try to sort of convey that. Now, of course, the classical examples are scientists in trouble. Scientists get in trouble historically, if you look back in the history of science, all the time, because the whole idea is we're trying to push out beyond the conventions of the time, and naturally people who like the conventions of the time don't like people who do that. And so one of the things that happens is scientists always tend to be these kinds of solitary figures in trouble. And Galileo, of course, is the classical example, where there's a whole business about, what's going on, which kind of solar system you want, and I can go into some interesting things about that, but I don't want to go down that road. What I really want to say is there was a question of fact about what the natural world really did, and then there was the moral, social, civil question about what authority said actually happens in the world. And the point I want to make a distinction with here, because it's often presented, the Galileo story is presented as a conflict between religion and science. And I think that that's really misleading. I mean, there was an element of that, I'm sure, but there was a misleading aspect here, because in that period, religion and politics and civil authority were very much connected. And so in many respects, this was a conflict between politics and science. What are the facts versus who you should obey, right? I mean, that's the sort of classical thing. So Galileo was the first one, and everyone knows about that. And it didn't end so well. He ended up under house arrest for the rest of his life. Einstein is another example. In the 1930s, in Nazi Germany, and of course, you had these crazy things being written, Jewish physics versus not Jewish physics. I mean, this was actually written in the journals. I mean, it's, if anyone with any rational mind would think it was completely obscene, I mean, it's absurd. But that was the reality, because people had this Nazi agenda, and they couldn't stop or pull back from saying, well, does that apply to the natural world? And they should say no, but they don't. And that's, of course, one of the points. And of course, Einstein is a famous denouncement by 100 physicists of Einstein's work, and he made some sort of quip that's been remembered ever since, in which he said, they don't really need 100. All it takes is one, to say that I'm wrong. Now, of course, that's not just unique, and that's something a little bit more modern, and also more poignant in a way, because it's something that hasn't really been discredited like Nazi Germany, and that's the Soviet era. There were some famous cases, the case of Lysenko, and this Lysenkoism in terms of how genetics would work. The idea there was that the giraffe would exercise its neck, and then the next generation would have a longer neck. That was the sort of idea. And that really resonated well with the political ideology of the day. And as a result, if you had some more, well, shall we say, scientifically acceptable way of thinking of it, such as Nikolai Vavilov, then you would be in trouble because you weren't sort of consistent with the proper outlook on science. And Vavilov died over that. He was killed. Now, the influence of this, I find this, personally, I find this kind of so amazing, so absurd. The absurdity of it is amazing. It's a kind of a guilty pleasure to read about these things. But there was a rather famous astronomer who was very well known in Russia, and he was an astronomer, not a politician, not a political guy. But in his famous book on the world of the stars, he throws in a line which says, which he hails the greatest genius of all mankind, Comrade Stalin. So stars, Comrade Stalin. So it's something to bear in mind. There's this political world of how human beings organize themselves, intruding into something which has nothing to do with that. Another example is the very famous book by Vladimir Fock. There's a very famous physicist by the name of Fock who was involved in quantum electrodynamics and gravitation and so forth. And he wrote this famous book, which I have, and it's it's things like Minkowski space and Riemannian Riemannian metrics, and all kinds of exotic physics and so forth. And then in the introduction, underneath the end of the introduction, there are a bunch of little asterisks, and down that there's an extra paragraph. And the extra paragraph says, the philosophical side of our views on the theory of space-time and gravitation was formed under the influence of the philosophy of dialectical materialism, in particular under the influence of Lenin's materialism and empirio-criticism. The teaching of dialectical materialism helps us to approach critically Einstein's point of view concerning the theory created by him and to think it out anew. It helped us also to understand correctly and to interpret the new results we ourselves obtained. We wish to state this here, although this book does not explicitly touch philosophical questions. So then the next chapter goes on to mathematics again, right? So that's you makes you realize about this. Now I want to bring this into the modern era, this idea of some ideological, political things coming in and becoming into conflict with scientific reality. And nothing really does that more for me anyway, is the sort of modern, postmodern, cultural Marxist idea of feminist fluid mechanics. And yeah, you might find this very strange, but what's the various people, the sort of postmodern type people, have gone through the humanities like, I don't know, some kind of avenging hordes, and they have just overturned and said everything is wrong and started over again, and they've had a couple of goes at science, and the results have been, obscene. And I'm going to read some of this to you, so if you don't like vulgar things, don't worry, because this is an academic who wrote this, so by definition, anything an academic writes in an academic journal can't be vulgar, right? So anything I'm saying now, I'm warning you, is not vulgar, okay? So, okay. This author writes, instead of talking about differential equations, talking about momentum, talking about vorticity, and a whole bunch of really interesting things that come out of the study of advanced calculus and differential equations and the physics of fluids, Newton's laws, and so on, you end up with this very, very sophisticated and elegant theory of how fluids move and how they work. But she goes on in a different way, and she does it in a very peculiar way. She talks about what some other author is working on, or as my old friend Ben Singer would say, the authoress. It's one of the sociologists that was talked about before, right? I mean, that's... yeah. Her answer posits a complicity of long standing between rationality and a mechanics of fluids. The privileging of solid fluid mechanics, that phrase itself, the privileging of solid fluid mechanics, of solid mechanics over fluid mechanics, means that somehow solid mechanics was discriminating against fluid mechanics. I mean, it's a very interesting way to think. And indeed, the inability of science to deal with turbulent flow at all, that's one of the most fundamental unsolved problems in modern science, is turbulence. They can't do it. So she attributes to the association of fluidity with femininity. Whereas men have sex organs that protrude and become rigid. Women have openings that leak menstrual blood and vaginal fluids. Now remember, this is not vulgar, okay? This is written by an academic. Okay? Although men, too, flow on occasion when semen is emitted, for example, this aspect of their sexuality is not emphasized. It is the rigidity of the male organ that counts, not its complicity in fluid flow. You can be complicit in fluid flow, it's like a crime. These idealizations are reinscribed in mathematics. I have no idea what that means. Which conceives of fluids as laminated planes and other modified solid forms. In the same way that women are erased with masculinist theories and language, existing only as not men, as so fluids have been erased from science, existing only as not solids. From this perspective, it is no wonder that science has not been able to arrive at a successful model of turbulence. The problem of turbulent flow cannot be solved because the conceptions of fluids, and of women, have been formulated as necessarily to leave unarticulated remainders. Unarticulated remainders. I don't know what that is. Anyway, but the upshot of it is really simple. The reason why we haven't solved this basic problem of modern science is because of discrimination against women. I could have said that in a very simple way. So there's a perfect example in a modern world where people's political ideology is so intense and so strong, it completely overwhelms their rational side. I mean, the reason why I especially wanted to bring that one up is so that people understand that this is not something that just happened with Galileo and before. It's happening right now, right? It's part of our modern world. A certain physicist did something once. His name was Alan Sokal, and he wrote a fake paper for one of the journals that published this stuff. And the title of the paper was Transgressing the Boundaries Toward a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, which of course is like utter nonsense, but the whole paper was nonsense, and then he came out and said it was nonsense, and it created a huge uproar afterwards. It's a very struggling kind of story, but I mean, it shows that there's this inability to distinguish these two parts of our humanity, which is the inner experience of motives and feelings and so forth, of morality and virtue, and Newton's laws and mathematics. They're both parts of the world that we experience, and they're all things that there are different modes that all of us can practice to one extent or another. But once you mix them together, you end up starting to generate nonsense. So we have this problem, which is very much apparent in the whole climate discussion, is this confusion between morality and truth. In other words, you can't be true unless you're moral. And then they define what morality is, and as a result, then people are false just purely because they're not virtuous. But this is utter nonsense. There's no such thing as a moral thunderstorm or immoral trees. You elm over there, you're an immoral, you're a bad elm, a bad elm, It's nonsense. Mother Teresa, now Saint Teresa, was virtuous, but she could be dead wrong about some natural fact. Just because she was virtuous didn't make her right about scientific facts. Similarly, vested interests can be greedy, self-interested, but still absolutely right. So what does that mean about receiving money from oil companies? Does that mean that what you say is wrong? in the current thinking, if you are even associated, there's even a whiff of a connection, then what you say scientifically is wrong. Even if the oil companies might be right. They could be wrong, they might be right. The scientific mode of thought is only about what's right or wrong in nature. It doesn't matter what the origins of it are, but this is just simply widely accepted in the political world. You don't associate with oil companies. The notion of deserve to die, which was the thing that got us down this road, is the case of in the case of an external physical threat. It's not a matter of morality. It's a matter of maybe stupidity. Maybe you deserve to die if you put a loaded .38 beside your night table when the alarm goes off and you grab that and shoot yourself. Maybe you deserve to die because you're stupid, right? I mean, it's stupidity. That's the thing that gets you in the end, is being stupid. And all of us can be stupid, right? I mean, I can be stupid, everyone can be. But maybe that's something to bear in mind. It's not about morality. Now let's talk about, that was the little apocalypse. Let's talk about the big apocalypse. That's where everybody dies, or maybe nearly everybody dies. Here we have to go into some kind of cultural discussion, and one of the phrases or sentences that I really have always been attracted to since my youth was this apocalyptic statement from the Eddas, which are these compilations of Norse lore. Which you can look at in Iceland, which is having a big election today, and maybe the Pirate Party will win. We'll see. In any event, the quote is, "The gods are doomed, and the end is death." That's apocalypse. So we have Ragnarok, that's the Norse apocalypse. Götterdämmerung, which is German, which basically means Ragnarok. Armageddon, and you probably saw that in one of the annotations, give Bob a hard time over that. The Book of Revelations, that's where it all comes out. A lot of this stuff is so ancient, it's so inscribed in who we are. It's positively Jungian, but it's part of who we are as human beings. We are naturally concerned about the future. We don't really know why we're in this universe or how we're in this universe, and we have to rely upon things like faith or some sort of conviction of one kind or another to somehow navigate through this wonderful, enormous mystery that we live with all of our lives. So today we have 5 horsemen of the apocalypse. Most people know the usual idea is 4, but today we have 5. We have war, pestilence, famine, death, and climate change. All of this stuff, when it's realized in the modern world, is some strange combination of fear, fashion, and desire to control other people. I mean, this is the sort of combination that we're always talking about. And in the sense of fashion, you can see that in the background that all of this stuff is going on in fashion. The fact that the conservative platform is about a carbon policy and not carbon dioxide is an indication of a lack of regard for the actual scientific content. It's a political arena they're dealing in, and that's why they talk that way. Is there such a thing, when I go to the grocery store, I always wonder, is there such a thing as inorganic bananas? I don't know. I've come across pickles in which they announce that they're gluten-free. Is there such a thing as pickles with gluten, which is wheat protein? Why would pickles have wheat protein in it? I mean, I don't know. Then, of course, we have dihydrogen monoxide, which, of course, sounds very threatening. And they actually got people to sign a petition to ban dihydrogen monoxide because it was found in mother's milk and corporations use it. So people signed ban dihydrogen monoxide. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is not just apocalypse itself, the fact that it's in us and it's part of it. To what extent are we responsible for apocalypse? And one of the things that's very clear is that when people, the cultural, deep, fashionable sense of apocalypse, we believe that we are responsible for it. That's one of the things that's very, very clear. And it's not just today with climate change. I had a friend who studied Flemish newspapers in the 18th century, and he read them. And one of the things that was very clear in his accounts of what was happening is all the things that were going on in that era. They had all kinds of things like crop failures and plagues, and they had cold summers and things like that, probably from a volcano or something like that. And the consensus of the 18th century newspapers was that there was an explanation for this, and there was a cause, and the cause was us, human beings, because we were sinners and God was punishing us. Now, does that sound an awful lot like what we're experiencing right now? It's the same stuff. So I think I've kind of gone over the idea of how people are naturally inclined to look at apocalypse, that there's this idea of fashion in the sense that people get caught up in things that are like gluten and so forth. And a lot of the stuff about climate is in that category. Then there's real apocalypse. And this is, of course, the real bummer. And I said that I was going to make an effort to scare you with the facts. And now I'm going to do that. Because I want the other big elephant, the even bigger elephant in the room is that we're all going to die, is that I can tell you with certainty that the world is going to end. It's not a question of whether, it's a question of when. It could either be by chance sooner or by certain natural realities later. So you can forget about the idea of sustainability in any kind of absolute sense. It's not going to happen because ultimately, one thing is going to ruin sustainability if it's nothing more than the second law of thermodynamics. So let's go over some of these non-human caused apocalypses. I love the idea of saying that in the plural because it's not something that people usually talk about. Well, I mean, there's of course pestilence. Everyone's good with pestilence. That was one of the four horsemen. Then you have things like super volcanoes. I mean, I don't know if you've heard of those things, but the press, of course, likes to generate articles and get everyone all wound up. Super volcanoes, they're going to blow one day and we're all going to die. Sounds like the guy on the plane, you remember that? And of course, there's asteroids and comets. And it's important you understand asteroids and comets. There's a lot of work being done trying to track small asteroid, Earth-crossing asteroids, and I know some of the people involved in it. One of the better developed programs trying to figure out how to stop them from hitting the Earth. And you have to understand that if one of those hits the Earth, that of any reasonable size, we're done, right? I mean, you have to understand that. I mean, forget about climate change. I mean, that's the ultimate climate change, I mean, we're finished, right? If it's a really big one, right? We're talking about things far in excess of the energies that human beings, even something that's, kilometer size or something like that, is already bigger than the biggest bombs that you could throw or blow up. There are some caveats. So the Russians' program of defense against cosmic objects, it sounds a little bit like Harry Potter. I mean, it's sort of defense against dark arts, right? Yeah, that's right. But they actually have a program on that, and it's very well developed, and I encourage them to continue with that. Then you have something in the sun, and then if you go out, I don't know, a fraction of a light year, there's a kind of a sphere of debris left over from the origin of the solar system. It's called the Oort cloud. And inside the Oort cloud, there are billions of frozen snowballs. And these things are jiggling around, and they're moving past each other, and every now and again, one falls into the major part of the solar system. And these things come in fast, and there's no precedent. People don't know where they're coming from. And the chances of stopping one of them, their energies are going to be large. The chances of us stopping one are pretty slim, and if one actually hits them, it's terribly unlikely. It's just like, when I was going down in that plane, I knew that we probably would be okay, but I wasn't completely sure, right? So it's the same kind of thing. So these things are coming in. It's like a little bit like being in a pinball machine. Occasionally we're coming through and these things come down. One of them hits us, we're done, right? Okay, I hope you understand that. Then there are sun problems with our star. Of course, we're accustomed to it being like this this energizer battery that will never end as the rabbit just keeps going and so forth. But stars have lifetimes, and stars change. It's sitting down on what the astrophysicists call the main sequence right now, and it's burning hydrogen, and it's using up about 1 million or 4 million tons of of hydrogen is just being converted into pure energy every second. It's like 4 million tons, gone, 4 million, that's it, millions, right? Every second it's doing this, it's using up this fuel, and eventually what's going to happen is it's going to run out of fuel of that type, and it's going to not be able to hold itself up against gravity, and it'll collapse down, and then it'll start getting hot enough to burn the next elements on the periodic table and nuclear fusion, and it'll just keep going like that. So we don't know what's going to happen exactly. We know that other stars, like the sun, are somewhat more active, a little bit more violent than ours. Now, is that because they're just set up differently, or is it because during a certain period they will change? Nobody knows for sure, but when the sun changes a lot, we might be able to manage to cope with it to a certain extent. Meanwhile, we have these things, these coronal mass ejections, where it throws off huge amounts of ionized particles out into the solar system. They get melded into something called the solar wind. And if it's a big pile of this ionized stuff and it hits the Earth, we can have something that's known as a Carrington event. And that's named after something that happened in the 19th century, and before the US Civil War, the 1840s or something like that, when telegraph operators discovered they could send telegraph signals without having them attached to a battery, because there was just enough energy going on from this event. The whole sky over all latitudes, or at least a lot of latitudes anyway, was all lit with aurora borealis. And if that happened to us today, it would almost certainly knock out a lot of these major transformers in the net, because the power grid is actually like a giant low-frequency antenna, and it's just going to pick this signal up, and it's going to hammer these transformers, and they'll get burned out. And the problem with these transformers is they're giant industrial ones, aren't ones that you just go and pick up a new one off the shelf. It might take you several industrial years to build a new one. And so the power will be down, and in the process, our society, which is built on power, a lot of people probably die. And it could all be fixed if we would stop navel gazing and actually just build these replacements and have them ready in case of something like that happening. But it seems so far, everyone's so gay and delightful, it's all wonderful. Why do you worry about something like this? Well, those things that you can actually do something about, worry about those and then do something. There's the stellar evolution and so on. But I want to talk now about stellar problems. And there's all kinds of things. I want to get into that. And I've left off a whole bunch of other ways in which the world could end, but we only have so much time. Stellar problems, gamma ray bursters, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how they come about. But basically, if a gamma ray burst was actually fired at us, it would be like a giant sterilization. We just, we're done. Gamma ray burst, gone. There's something. I hope are you scared yet? I mean, that's okay. So I want to do now to sort of shift the topic a little bit, because one of the things I don't want to just talk about is what could go wrong. I want to tell you about something else, which is part of the contemporary thinking, which is actually wrong. Contemporary thinking is that somehow we are the author of our own problems, and that nature is basically benevolent, and that we have to be good and good stewards of this thing that we can control, that we're omniscient and omnipotent, we can control everything and so forth. And I want to disabuse you of that. And I want to bring apocalypse in a very unlikely way. So I'm going to begin with this. You can see this is a wedding ring, and it's in fact my wedding ring that symbolizes my marriage to my lovely wife Sharon over there of 38 years. But when I look at this, I also see apocalypse. I don't know, not because of her. And to explain why I see apocalypse with that, I have to go back in time. And I have to go back really far in time, back to just not long after the origin of the universe, the Big Bang. When the universe began, the current understanding is that there was only hydrogen. There was maybe a little helium, but no hydrogen. And so that is a really remarkable thing, because it means that everything in this room, which is the stuff that our world is made out of, the walls, the carpets, my lectern, you, are all made of stuff that shouldn't exist if it was just like that. All of the stuff that exists of this type had to have been cooked up in little factories that made this stuff. And these factories are known as stars, right? So the stars actually cook up all the material, all the carbon, all the various materials in here, the nitrogen, all that stuff comes from nuclear reactions in the heart of stars. And that explains pretty much everything, and it explains us. We are made out of stardust, which I think is a really cool thing. Just incredibly cool. But where does that leave this ring? There's something that needs to be known, which is that this process in which the cooking takes place works really well, making bigger and heavier elements, until you get to iron. And once iron is hit, it doesn't work anymore. Gold is heavier than iron. So where did it come from? That's the question. And the answer is, it comes from the biggest explosions in the universe. And it's important you understand that the power of the universe and the scale of the universe is utterly beyond us. And I don't think that this is a small point. This is an enormous point in terms of how we think of where we fit into the world. Instead of thinking about us being benevolent towards nature, we should be thinking about banding together to defend ourselves against nature. We should be thinking about how to protect ourselves when something bad might happen, rather than thinking about how we should lower our protections and be, gentle, benevolent gods, because we're not gods. And I want to sort of drive that idea home. The thing that causes this gold to exist is something that's an explosion called a titanic cataclysm called a supernova. And supernovas come in many different types, and some of the lowest energy of them, I won't go into the details, but some of the lowest energy versions of them generate energy in this neighborhood of 10 to the 44 power joules. Now, I'm going to spend a few moments explaining what that might mean, but that means that's 1 with 44 zeros. Now, I thought about how to explain that in a couple of ways, and I thought, since I'm comparing it to what human beings can do, I would take our biggest explosion that human beings can make, and which of course would be a hydrogen bomb, right? That's the biggest the biggest bang we can imagine. It's like never mind your fireworks display. Let's go to the atomic weapons, and let's go to the really big ones. So the ones everyone knows about, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these terrible tragedies, kiloton. That's of TNT. That's about what roughly, maybe a bit more, right? But that's roughly what it is. If you increase that by 50,000 times, you'll get the modern, really big, probably not actually made, but thought about hydrogen bomb, where you use an atomic bomb to set off the hydrogen bomb. I mean, that's basically what it is. And it works a little bit the way the sun works, right? And you can get about 100 times that, a megaton. So if you have 1 million tons of TNT, and then take 100 times that, that's about the biggest that we can imagine. That's the biggest bang that our human beings will be able to put together to show our godly powers. And that comes to about 10 to the 17 joules compared to 10 to the 44. And what does that mean? That means if you divide one into the other, that means that the supernova is something like 10 to the 27 power hydrogen bombs, mega hydrogen bombs, 10 to the 27 power. And that's even hard to understand. So I'm going to try to give you an idea of how that works. 10 to the 27. Well, first of all, let's imagine setting this up uniformly over time. All the time we have. All the time back to the beginning of the Big Bang, which is about 10 to the 10 years. So if we let our super hydrogen bombs off, so to be equivalent to the amount of energy released in one of these supernovas, we would go all the way back to the beginning of time, 10 to the 10 years, into 10 to the 27, that leaves 10 to the 17 hydrogen bombs we'd have to set off every year since the Big Bang to have the same amount. And I'm going to push that one step further, because every year has about 10 to the 7 seconds in it. So 10 to the 17 of these bombs, dividing through by 10 to the 7, that means you have to set off 10 billion of our biggest 100 megaton nuclear weapons, 10 billion of them every second since the Big Bang, to be as big as just one of these. Okay, that gives you an idea of how small and what a puff in the wind we are. Now, these things don't occur that often, that fortunately for us, but these are the ones that generate the gamma ray bursters and things like that. So these things don't happen that often. We've had some in 1,000 years ago. We had about 2 or 3. There was one in 1987 in another galaxy, which you could see at night with the naked eye. What I want to do is I want to leave you with apocalypse on a scale you can't just grasp. And I'm going to do this with my apocalypse generator here. And I have this apocalypse generator. And what I'm going to point out to you is that turn on my apocalypse generator. And we'll make sure that it's all the way up so that everyone can hear. And also the people at home, when the recording comes out, can actually hear. And I'm going to make sure that this is okay. So we're pretty much ready now. What I'm going to play for you is a mapping of data from observations of actual supernovas that have taken place over a 3-year period. So this is a 3-year period. One of the epiphanies I had as a young man when I was a scientist student was to look at a deep field star field and realize, much to my utter amazement, is that most of the objects in the deep field were not stars, but they're other galaxies. There were more galaxies than there were stars. I mean, that was the epiphany. And these galaxies were billions of light years away. If you take a telescope, and this is what this music is going to be about, and you record or put a wide field camera on a certain area of the sky where these galaxies are and watch them, they observed over a 3-year period 240 of these cataclysmic explosions, which each one constitutes an apocalypse, because all the stars for light years around were in a it's the end of worlds. Every one of these things is the end of worlds, and they get 240 of them. And one enterprising astronomer by the name of Parker decided to map these onto music. And what he did was he chose the pitch based upon properties of the particular supernova, and the musical instrument to use based upon the size of the galaxy, the volume associated with how far away it was, and then he mapped it all on so that every single note was itself an apocalypse. And that, I think, is something that we're going to listen to now. You'll hear some background stuff, but every note, you'll hear a bass violin and you'll hear a piano. And remember, each note is the end of a world. That's apocalypse. That's
Why
what
don't
the,
there be karaoke at the local pub?
this is the end of worlds, and it's real. It's not. This is not fake apocalypse. It's not fashionable apocalypse. It's the reality of the nature that we live in. The scale is beyond our abilities. This is all way beyond us. And so one of the things that I'd like to how I'd like to end this, I'd like to do it in a Bob Metz kind of way. And I'm going to make a reference to the movies to end this and to put it into a proper perspective. And the movie I have in mind is called Unforgiven. And there's a very end of the movie where the small apocalypse is about to happen. Gene Hackman has been wounded and he's laying prone on the floor. And William Money, played by Clint Eastwood, has a shotgun, and he's pointing down at Gene Hackman. And Gene Hackman says up to Clint Eastwood, he says, "I don't deserve this." And then Clint Eastwood says, "Deserve's got nothing to do with it." Bang! Thank you very much.
Well, I'm left with a couple of impressions. One is that rather than go away thinking that we're all very small in the universe, I think that the very fact that a human mind can understand the universe to that extent makes me feel very big. And secondly, I think we should have renamed this "We're All Gonna Die." Thanks, everybody. I think that's it for this evening. We have some time to mingle, so please do.
On our own, none of us can hope to solve the challenge posed by climate change. It's just not possible. No single province or state, no single country can on its own, through its own actions, shift the balance and eliminate the threat.